Welcome back to my channel, where real story takes its time. Let's get into it.
I'm Henry, 34, and I've always considered myself someone who tries to do right by my family, even when it feels like they don't reciprocate. Growing up, I was close to my parents, or at least I thought I was. My dad, especially, always had a way of making you feel like you were never quite good enough, no matter what you accomplished. My mom, on the other hand, would hover somewhere between being nurturing and condescending, constantly pointing out flaws she deemed fixable, but never offering real support. For the most part, I learned to just swallow my feelings and try to make things work, believing that family loyalty meant sticking it out through all of it. I also have a son, Noah, who is 8 and the absolute center of my world. He was diagnosed with a rare medical condition when he was 3, and while it's manageable with proper treatment, the costs are outrageous. Insurance covers some, but the rest falls on me. And that's where my family's generosity really started to, or rather, failed to show. The first real crack in the facade came last year. I had called my parents, hoping for help with a particularly expensive treatment that Noah needed. It wasn't a small amount, about $20,000, but it was life-saving, and I didn't know where else to turn. I explained the situation, laid out every detail, and tried to make it clear that Noah's treatment wasn't optional. My father listened, nodding along as if he were taking notes. Then, when I paused for a response, he said, in the calmest voice imaginable, "Henry, he's not really part of this family, is he? I mean, not by blood. He's wonderful, I'm sure, but he's not one of us." I remember my stomach dropping. I wanted to laugh, maybe throw something, maybe just cry. I didn't. Instead, I said, carefully, "He's my son." And I thought family meant helping each other. There was a long silence, and then he said, "Well, think about it," which, in their world, might as well have been a polite way of saying no. After that, things got tense, but I tried to keep my interactions civil. My sister, Elise, who's 3 years younger than me, seemed to get along with them perfectly. She never had kids, never struggled financially, and somehow always had a golden aura in their eyes. I chalked it up to sibling dynamics at first. Maybe I was just sensitive, but then, a few months ago, I found out the truth. My parents had decided to give her the bulk of their inheritance. Not a little, not a token amount, most of it. She'd been buying a new house, traveling overseas, and redecorating her apartment, all with the funds that, in my mind, could have helped Noah with treatments, therapy sessions, or even just giving him some breathing room. The thing that broke me wasn't just the money. It was that they dismissed my plea entirely. I confronted my mom once, gently, trying to understand. I said, "Mom, why not help Noah? This isn't about Elise or me. It's about him." She looked at me with those cold, calculating eyes that I'd learned to fear over the years and said, "Honey, Elise is part of this family. Noah, well, you know how your father feels." And that was it. No empathy, no justification, no compromise. Just a reminder that my son, the person who mattered most to me, was an outsider in my own family. I spent weeks after that lying awake at night, thinking about what it meant to be a parent, what it meant to be family, and how the people who are supposed to support you unconditionally could look at someone you love and say, essentially, not good enough. I began to notice the little things, too. Invitations to family gatherings that excluded Noah, snide remarks about how much time I spent at home, suggesting I was distracting myself with that child, instead of being part of the family. My dad would make jokes at my expense, like when we were at my cousin's birthday, and he muttered, "I guess Henry's little project can't make it tonight," and everyone laughed. It wasn't the first time they'd made me feel like a charity case or an outsider, but hearing it directly tied to my son made it sting in a way I couldn't ignore. It all came to a head last month. I was invited to dinner at my parents' house, the first in a while since everything had gotten so tense. I didn't really want to go, but Elise had mentioned how excited she was for a new promotion, and part of me wanted to see her happy, or maybe just to see if my parents would show the tiniest shred of decency. The moment I walked in, I could feel the difference in energy. My parents greeted me with the same politeness as always, but the warmth was gone, replaced by this underlying judgment. Elise was there, perfectly coiffed, and smiling in a way that screamed, "I'm untouchable in this household." Noah wasn't invited, which, at this point, didn't surprise me, but still hurt like a fresh wound. Dinner started normally enough. My dad droned on about his golf game. My mom interjected with updates on her volunteer work, and Elise chimed in with her new apartment renovations. I tried to keep the conversation light at first, but the tension in my chest made every laugh and nod feel like a personal attack. Then, my father made what I can only describe as the most dismissive comment I'd heard in years. He looked at me over his plate, and with that calm, almost clinical tone he has, said, "You know, Henry, maybe you should consider that some things just aren't meant for you. Some families, they have different priorities." It hit me like a punch to the gut. I clenched my fork so hard my knuckles turned white, and for a moment, I just stared at him, trying to figure out if he even realized what he'd said. I wanted to respond, to snap, to shout, but I didn't. Instead, I kept my voice even, carefully modulated so as not to give them the satisfaction of seeing me break. "You mean like how you gave Elise everything while ignoring my requests for Noah's treatment?" I asked slowly. Silence. My mom shifted uncomfortably. Elise's smile faltered slightly, and my dad, well, he just stared at me like I'd grown another head. There was no defense, no clever comeback, just the realization that I had spoken the truth, and the truth had no place at their dinner table. I left that night simmering in anger and hurt. But I also felt something I hadn't felt in years, clarity. They were the same people who had always treated me as less than. The same people who would never prioritize Noah or me over Elise or their own sense of pride. I realized that if I wanted to protect my son, if I wanted him to feel valued, I couldn't rely on them anymore. And that's when the first real spark of a plan started to form. It wasn't about confrontation, it was about strategy, about showing them, once and for all, that their choices had consequences and that ignoring me and Noah would not go unanswered. I don't want to jump too far ahead, but sitting in my car that night, gripping the steering wheel, I thought about all the years of slights, the subtle undermining, the outright dismissals. And I realized something terrifying and exhilarating. I didn't have to scream, I didn't have to beg. I could be patient. I could be smarter. I could make them regret ever treating my family as less than theirs. For the first time, I began to imagine what a true reckoning might look like. That was the beginning of everything. The anger, the planning, the slow-burning tension that would eventually lead to the moment where I'd have their full attention. They wouldn't see it coming, not in a million years. And yet, even as I drove home that night, part of me felt a quiet thrill at the thought of the control I was about to reclaim, not just for me, but for Noah, and for the principle that your family can't decide who deserves respect and who doesn't. From that night onward, I started observing them in ways I never had before. I noticed their routines, their little habits, the way they bragged about Elise's accomplishments and glossed over mine. I kept careful records, mental notes at first, but eventually started writing things down. Every unfair comment, every dismissive glance, every time they laughed at something I said or dismissed Noah in conversation, it was all cataloged. I wanted them to see that their actions were not invisible, that their favoritism, their entitlement, their blatant disregard for my family had consequences. The tension between us continued to escalate over the next few weeks. Family dinners became exercises in endurance. Elise, oblivious to the brewing storm, would recount her vacations and her new purchases, blissfully unaware, or maybe knowingly indifferent, to the effect her words had on me. My parents would exchange subtle glances, the kind that carried years of judgment and condescension, and I would feel my patience stretch thinner and thinner. At the same time, a cold, calculating part of me started thinking about leverage, about what would actually make them listen. It wasn't enough to confront them verbally anymore. They needed a display, a concrete demonstration that ignoring Noah and dismissing me would not be tolerated. And that's where the real tension began. The part that I can feel building every time I think about walking into their house, sitting at that table again, and finally, making them understand just what it means to cross the wrong person. After that dinner, I couldn't stop thinking about just how far my parents would go to exclude Noah and elevate Elise. It felt like every interaction with them from then on was a test of my patience, or, more accurately, a constant reminder of just how little they valued me and my family. The more I reflected, the clearer it became. This wasn't about money, or even about preference. This was about control, about proving that they decided who mattered, and anyone who didn't fit their narrow mold, like me, like Noah, was expendable. Over the next few weeks, the mistreatment became almost unbearable. It started small, in ways that could almost be dismissed if you weren't paying attention. My parents would send invitations to Elise for every event, big or small, while leaving me off the list entirely. Even casual gatherings, like Sunday brunches or neighborhood barbecues, were family time that Noah and I weren't welcome at. Sometimes they'd apologize over the phone, using that patronizing tone that implied, "It's nothing personal, really," but it was so clearly personal and painfully deliberate. Elise, for her part, seemed to float effortlessly in this world my parents had constructed. She'd post pictures of new furniture, new vacations, new experiences, often in the same rooms and events I'd never been invited to. I'd scroll through them late at night while Noah slept, feeling this gnawing mix of anger and heartbreak. He didn't understand the injustice yet. He just knew he wanted to be included, like any kid, but I could see the frustration in his little face when he asked why he couldn't go to a cousin's birthday or see Grandma and Grandpa. Each time he asked, it felt like a physical blow. One afternoon, I had to go to my parents' house to pick up some paperwork Elise had asked me to handle for her. I knocked, expecting a quick handoff, but what I got instead was a full demonstration of everything I'd been fearing. The moment my dad opened the door, I could feel it. His entire posture radiated disapproval. I was there for Elise, yes, but apparently even that small act of connection with my family threatened him. "Henry," he said, voice flat, eyes narrowing just enough to make me uncomfortable. "I suppose you're just dropping this off for Elise?" "Yes," I said calmly. "She asked me to pick it up. I'm just doing her a favor." He muttered, stepping aside without a word of welcome. "Well, make it quick." Inside, Elise was laughing on the couch, sprawled comfortably with her laptop, completely unconcerned about my presence. My mom, ever the observer, didn't acknowledge me at all, instead offering Elise some snack or comment about her latest plans. I handed over the papers, trying not to let my frustration show. And that's when Elise, with this casual ease that made my blood boil, looked at me and said, "Thanks, I guess. Too bad you're never around when it matters." I froze. The words weren't just dismissive, they were cruelly precise. I'd been bending over backward to help her in any way I could, and she, fully aware of the dynamics at play, decided that now was the perfect time to rub it in. I wanted to shout, to tell her what her parents had said about Noah, to make her feel a fraction of the hurt she and they had caused, but I swallowed it. Calm, patient, observing, filing the moment away. Then came the real betrayal. I'd been trying to find a way to get my parents to understand, to see that Noah needed them, to appeal to whatever sense of family they claimed to have left. I thought maybe a small gesture would work, a family gathering, a discussion, some honest conversation without judgment. I suggested a dinner at my apartment, inviting both Elise and my parents. I planned it carefully, soft lighting, Noah involved in helping prepare a few dishes, everyone seated in a way that would encourage conversation. I even baked a dessert that my dad had always said he loved as a child, thinking nostalgia might soften him. They all agreed to come. I was cautious but hopeful. Maybe this time, they'd see Noah for who he was, not as an outsider, not as a problem to be ignored, but as my family. I was wrong. From the moment they walked in, I could feel the tension shift in ways I hadn't anticipated. My parents brought their usual air of judgment. Elise arrived with her smug smile and immediately started criticizing minor things, the table setting, the choice of music, even how Noah was dressed. I tried to keep the evening civil, even cheerful, but every attempt was met with subtle undermining, cutting remarks, and coldness from my parents. And then, halfway through dinner, the betrayal landed. I had placed Noah's medication on the counter earlier, quietly, so I could give it to him after the meal. My dad noticed, leaned down slightly toward Elise, and said in a voice just loud enough for me to hear, "See that? Henry can't even manage basic responsibilities for his own son. Good thing Noah isn't really part of this family. Imagine if he were. He'd be a burden." The words hit me like ice. The audacity of it, the way my parents conspired silently with Elise while pretending to be subtle, was almost too much to bear. Noah looked at me, puzzled, his little brow furrowed. He didn't understand the cruelty, but he felt it. He's always sensitive like that. I took a deep breath and said as evenly as I could, "He's my son, and I take care of him. That's enough for me." My mom gave me one of those looks, a mix of pity and exasperation, as if she were disappointed I still hadn't learned my place. Elise laughed lightly, patting my dad on the shoulder, the unspoken alliance between them clear as day. I realized then that no matter how I tried, no matter what small gestures I offered, no one in that house was on my side. They weren't a family. They were a fortress built on favoritism and exclusion. By the end of the evening, the full extent of the betrayal was clear. My parents left with Elise, and I stayed behind with Noah. I watched them go, feeling a mix of rage and grief. My son deserved better. I deserved better. And for the first time in years, I stopped trying to convince myself that maybe they'd change, maybe they'd see reason, maybe they'd act like parents who loved me and their grandchildren. They wouldn't. Not ever. That night, lying awake with Noah asleep beside me, I felt something shift inside. The anger was still there, simmering, but it was now sharper, colder, and clearer. The mistreatment, the favoritism, the betrayal, it all had a pattern, and I could use that. I didn't need to beg them, plead with them, or even confront them directly. I could observe, plan, and act in ways that would leave them powerless. I could make them understand, in ways that words never could, that their actions had consequences. The breaking point wasn't just what they said or did that evening. It was realizing that everything I'd endured, every slight, every dismissal, had built up into a fuel that I could finally harness. The seed of revenge had been planted, and now it was growing faster than I expected. I could feel the tension in my chest every time I thought about the next family dinner, the next event where they assumed they could exclude us without repercussion. The realization that I had a strategy forming, that I could quietly reclaim control and make them face the truth of their cruelty, was intoxicating. Over the following days, I started putting things in motion. I didn't want a petty argument, a shouting match, or a fleeting moment of satisfaction. I wanted something precise, something undeniable. I began keeping detailed notes, gathering evidence, documenting every instance of favoritism and insult, everything that showed the disparity between how they treated Elise and how they treated me and Noah. I started to think about leverage, about allies who could help me, about timing, and about the perfect setting for my eventual reckoning. But more than planning, I realized something fundamental. I had shifted from reacting to their cruelty to anticipating it. I had become patient, observant, calculating. And the longer I waited, the more they would reveal themselves, the more obvious their entitlement and favoritism would become. One day, I knew the right moment would come, a moment so undeniable, so perfectly timed, that they would finally grasp the impact of their choices. They wouldn't see it coming, and I would make sure they never forgot it. And yet, even as I thought about all this, I couldn't shake the gnawing anger that had settled into my chest. The betrayal wasn't just about money or favoritism. It was about recognition, respect, and love. They had taken from us what could never be replaced. Every family gathering, every conversation, every glance had reinforced that Noah and I were outsiders. The breaking point wasn't just that they ignored us. It was that they actively celebrated that exclusion. That, I realized, would be the key to everything, proving, in the clearest possible way, that they could no longer dictate who mattered in this family. The weeks after that disastrous dinner were some of the darkest I'd ever experienced. I felt like I was in a cage, trapped by my own family's cruelty and the helplessness of watching Noah suffer under circumstances I couldn't control. I had always prided myself on being the kind of person who could weather storms, but this wasn't a storm. It was a hurricane, and it was relentless. Every time I tried to call my parents, I felt the invisible barrier they'd erected, a mix of condescension and judgment that kept my pleas for Noah's well-being from landing. Elise, oblivious or willfully cruel, continued to flaunt her life, knowing exactly how much it hurt me. It was a psychological assault that left me feeling small, angry, and hopeless all at once. For a while, I sank into despair. I would sit in my apartment at night, watching Noah sleep, thinking about all the ways my family had failed him and me. I questioned everything: my choices, my abilities, even my worth. I thought about confronting them directly, about yelling, about storming into their home and demanding respect, but the cold part of me knew it would accomplish nothing. My parents thrived on drama they could control. They would twist any confrontation into proof that I was unstable, incapable, or undeserving. I had to play a longer game. I had to rebuild quietly. The first step in rebuilding was rebuilding myself. I focused on Noah, yes, but also on myself. I started small, fixing things around my apartment, setting up a schedule, establishing routines that gave me control in a life where my family had tried to rob me of it. I began exercising regularly, not just for physical health, but to reclaim a sense of discipline and confidence. I started reading more, researching treatments for Noah, and educating myself about financial management. I knew I needed stability before I could plan anything else. Then came the work. I had a steady job, but it was far from enough to cover Noah's medical costs and save for future needs. I picked up extra hours, freelanced where I could, and started looking into side projects that could grow into something sustainable. I learned to be resourceful in ways I'd never had to be before, stretching every dollar, negotiating bills, finding programs that could help us. It was exhausting, and some days I felt like giving up entirely, but I kept going. I couldn't allow my family's cruelty to dictate the quality of life for my son or for myself. One particularly low evening, I remember sitting at my desk, staring at the pile of medical bills, and thinking about how unfair everything was. Tears came, unbidden, but I let them flow for a moment before wiping them away. This isn't the end, I whispered to myself. It's just the beginning. And in that moment, something shifted. The despair began to transform into determination. Every unfair comment, every exclusion, every betrayal became fuel, a raw energy I could channel into building something that even my parents couldn't ignore. I started small with Noah. I involved him in minor tasks, letting him feel capable and important. I encouraged him to express himself, to pursue his interests, to grow in a world where my parents' narrow definitions of worth didn't apply. Watching him gain confidence and joy was like watching sunlight break through a storm cloud. It reminded me of why I couldn't give up, not just for myself, but for him. Every time he laughed, every time he proudly showed me something new he had learned, I felt a piece of myself strengthen. Financially, I began to strategize. I had a modest savings account, but I needed something bigger, something that could not only cover Noah's medical bills, but also give us security and independence from my parents' whims. I researched investments, small business opportunities, and long-term financial planning. I knew I couldn't match Elisa's inheritance, and I didn't need to, but I could build something that gave me leverage, control, and a sense of power that my family had tried to deny me. I quietly started investing, building a network of clients and contacts, and slowly but surely, a plan began to take shape. During this period, I also started observing my family in ways I hadn't before. I noticed patterns, habits, and weaknesses. My parents, despite their arrogance, were predictable. They loved to flaunt Elisa's achievements, often exaggerating minor successes to make me feel small. Elise, for all her smugness, was careless, assuming that her parents' favoritism made her untouchable. Every conversation, every dinner, every social media post became a puzzle piece. I cataloged them all, mentally at first, then in writing. Every slight, every insult, every exclusion was being recorded, forming a roadmap for when the time came to act. Emotionally, I felt a slow but steady resurgence of self-worth. I reminded myself daily that I was not defined by their approval. I was a father, a provider, and a man who had fought for his son's life and dignity when those who should have cared most had abandoned their responsibility. I began to see the cracks in their carefully constructed facade. They looked polished, entitled, untouchable, but underneath, they were fragile. Their sense of superiority depended entirely on my silence and compliance. And now that silence had been broken, I also started building allies, quietly and discreetly. Friends who had seen my family's behavior firsthand offered advice, support, and a safe space to vent. I reached out to distant relatives who weren't caught up in my parents' favoritism, carefully gauging who might be sympathetic. Even small victories, like getting a sympathetic response from an aunt who had always been fond of me, reminded me that I wasn't truly alone, that the narrative my parents had spun about our outsider status could be challenged. One particularly powerful moment came when I received notice that a potential investment had finally paid off, modestly at first, but enough to give me a taste of independence. I remember holding the letter in my hand, feeling a wave of triumph and hope. It wasn't just about the money. It was about proving to myself that I could create stability, security, and a future for Noah that didn't depend on my parents' approval or resources. I realized that the fall I had endured, the exclusion, the betrayal, the heartbreak, wasn't the end. It was the foundation. From rock bottom, I was rebuilding, brick by brick, into something stronger, smarter, and more resilient than they could have imagined. With each passing week, the contrast between my life and Elise's became more defined, not in terms of luxury or showmanship, but in terms of strength, resilience, and principle. I didn't need to flaunt my progress. I just needed to let it grow quietly, letting my parents underestimate me while I quietly amassed the tools and resources I would need for the reckoning to come. Every time Elise or my parents made a smug comment about money, success, or priorities, it only reinforced my resolve. I wasn't playing by their rules anymore. I was building my own. Emotionally, I also had to learn patience. The part of me that wanted to explode, to confront them immediately, still lingered, but I knew that would be foolish. They thrived on drama and distraction. I had to be smart. I had to be measured. Every interaction, every dinner invitation, every family update became a chance to observe, to gather information, to anticipate weaknesses. I was no longer a passive participant in my own family's narrative. I was planning, calculating, and waiting for the right moment to turn the tables. By the end of this period, I felt something I hadn't in years: true control over my own life. I had created stability for Noah and myself. I had begun to understand the subtle dynamics of my family in a way that gave me leverage. I had transformed anger and despair into a slow-burning strategy. I was ready, in ways I had never been before, to reclaim what my parents had tried to deny us: respect, recognition, and a seat at the table of our own family. And yet, even as I felt this quiet rise, I knew that the final step, the confrontation, the reckoning, the moment when all the planning would pay off, was still ahead. The tension, the anticipation, the weight of the betrayal had all built to a point where nothing could remain as it was. They had underestimated me, underestimated Noah, underestimated the power of persistence, strategy, and quiet resolve. That underestimation, I realized, would be their undoing. From that rock bottom, I had built something stronger than anger. I had built power, self-worth, and an unshakable sense of purpose. And I knew that when the moment came to act, it would not be a scene of chaos or shouting. It would be precise, undeniable, and unforgettable. They would finally see the cost of their cruelty, and I would make sure that the truth of their favoritism, their entitlement, and their betrayal could no longer be ignored. They say the best revenge is living well, but I wanted something a little more precise than that. After months of rebuilding, researching, and quietly gathering the means to secure Noah's future, I realized that I also needed a plan that would force my parents to reckon with what they'd done. Not a violent outburst, not a public shaming for the sake of spectacle, something cleaner, surgical, something that would leave no room for their usual rewrite of the narrative. They were experts at gaslighting and looking moral while being cruel. Whatever I did had to be ironclad, documented, and impossible for them to spin away. The first move was information. While I was climbing my way back up, I'd been keeping careful notes, dates, texts, offhand comments, invitations that never came, and every time they'd made a remark about Noah not being part of the family. But documenting emotional cruelty wasn't enough. I needed leverage that mattered to them in a concrete way. My parents were picture-perfect in public: church socials, garden club events, community fundraisers. Their reputation, the comfortable social narrative they lived in, mattered. Elise lived off that glow. If I could show a crack in that image, something factual, undeniable, it would be a chisel to the facade they hid behind. I also realized there were more practical levers. My parents weren't reckless with money. They were careful, calculating, and proud of that. They banked in predictable places. They had advisors who catered to their ego, and they attended the same charity committees that doubled as social climbing clubs. I spent nights poring over public records, company filings, and any legal notes I could access without crossing into illegal territory. I wasn't trying to unearth criminality. I was looking for inconsistencies, small things that revealed how they had prioritized Elise financially, what they'd said in official settings versus the reality at home. There were surprising places this surfaced. Donation receipts in Elise's name for organizations she had never actually volunteered with, a history of loans co-signed for her businesses that were quietly forgiven, and a trail of social media proclamations about family values that didn't match the small, cruel realities I'd experienced. It wasn't one smoking gun. It was an accumulation, and accumulation is a powerful thing. Financial independence matters, too. The modest investment I'd made months earlier had started to grow on a slow, steady curve. I funneled profits into a small side business, consulting work I could do from home in the evenings, so it never interfered with Noah's schedule. The business was small potatoes compared to Elise's lifestyle, but that didn't matter. What mattered was that it gave me options, the ability to pay for medical bills without begging, the capacity to move if needed, and the means to invest in the next stage of my plan. Independence is a confidence builder. It allowed me to act with restraint instead of desperation. I could wait for the right moment without fear that everything would fall apart if I didn't act immediately. Allies came next, though I didn't call them that initially. I reached out discreetly to people who had been quietly sidelined by my parents' polished image, distant cousins, an aunt who lived out of state and had always been kinder to me than the rest, and a former neighbor who'd once told me offhand about a suspiciously generous gift my parents had given Elise years ago. None of it was dramatic. It was slow, me sipping coffee with people and listening to their side of the story, sharing only what felt necessary. I didn't want a mob. I wanted context, corroboration, and, if possible, a witness or two who could confirm the pattern I'd been documenting. People responded with an awkward honesty that surprised me. Once one person admitted awareness of favoritism, others followed. I wasn't the only one who'd noticed. I also started to use social media strategically, not to rant or to publicly shame, but to control the narrative around my life in subtle ways. I posted photos of Noah with the caption-style notes parents use, little victories, therapy milestones, school projects. Nothing that would tip my hand about the plan, but enough to show an alternative image, a calm, capable father who was building a stable life. My parents, predictably, didn't comment. Elise, predictably, liked and moved on. But friends and acquaintances, people my parents respected, started to ask questions in private messages, compliment Noah's progress, and offer small, tangible help. Leads for medical grant programs, recommendations for specialists, even a suggestion for a pro bono lawyer who helps families navigate elder financial matters when something smells off. I was careful not to accept too much help. This had to look organic, not orchestrated, but each thread I pulled added strength to the web I was building. There were also technical steps I took that felt boring but powerful. I consolidated our medical records, made copies, and organized bills into a binder with dates, invoices, and notes. I saved text messages and voicemails where my parents brushed me off, and I started saving receipts showing how Elise's life had been funded in ways that didn't match public statements. I opened a separate bank account for Noah's medical expenses, one that I funded through my new income streams, so there would be no question about the source of the money. The more I organized, the less chaotic everything felt, and the clearer my vision became. This was not about anger. It was about proof. Strategy also required patience. I had to wait for the right venue, the right moment that would make the evidence undeniable without me having to yell that they were cruel. My parents loved the rituals of family, the anniversary dinners, the church luncheons, the presentation nights at their neighborhood association where they always took center stage. Those rituals were performative, and performances depend on an audience. I started thinking about moments where the audience would be broad and sympathetic, where my parents' behavior would be glaringly inconsistent with the persona they cultivated. I pictured the charity gala they always attended, the one that ended with a speech about family values. I thought about the neighborhood association meeting where they'd been invited to speak about community support. I thought about Elisa's upcoming birthday party, where my parents would be expected to toast their daughter and everyone would cheer at how perfect they'd been. Those public rituals were weapons if used correctly. There was also a quieter, darker, if I'm honest, element to my plan that involved legal leverage. I would never risk crossing a legal line, but I did consult with a lawyer once I had the means, not to file charges, but to understand what documents could be requested, what evidence would hold up in a dispute about financial transfers and estate matters. The lawyer I consulted was discreet, practical, and blunt. If you have concrete evidence of preferential treatment or improper transfer of assets that was done under circumstances where your parents were not of sound mind, there are civil avenues. But what you're really after, if you want them to feel the consequence, is to make sure the community that validates them sees the gap between their words and their actions. That line stayed with me. He didn't encourage vengeance. He encouraged precision and standing within the law. I like that. It fit the person I'd become, controlled, strategic, and unafraid to use systems to engineer truth. I didn't ignore the human part of this equation. Revenge that's merely transactional feels hollow. I wanted them to understand the damage, not simply to be embarrassed. That meant timing a confrontation when the truth could not only be displayed, but also contextualized. I wanted witnesses who could corroborate documents that were impossible to dismiss, in a setting where their usual defenses, deflection, moral high ground, feigned hurt, wouldn't shield them. I wanted to force an internal collapse that would not be so much theatrical as inevitable. And so I began shaping the narrative slowly. I invited a few family members to dinners, not my parents, not directly, but people who mattered to them and who were not in their immediate inner circle. I cultivated small acts of normality, cards in the mail, holiday cookies dropped off at neighbors, because I didn't want to be seen as the dramatic child lashing out. I wanted to be patient and credible. I wanted to build a contrast that would make their favoritism look cruel and their denials look desperate. There were practical preparations too. Ensuring Noah's school had records prepared in case I needed testimony about exclusion, ensuring my bank statements and medical receipts were easily presentable, and safely duplicating any important files or photos that might be relevant. If this ever reached a community forum or legal stage, I wanted to be ready. None of this felt vindictive in the petty sense. It felt like armor. I was protecting my son and myself from a family that had been comfortable weaponizing ancestry and opinion to beat us into silence. I found small victories along the way. An anonymous tip I left at a neighbor's office about a supposedly family-funded charity event that, under close scrutiny, revealed duplicate donations credited to Elise, a sympathetic aunt who, after a careful conversation, agreed to be present at a family gathering with an open, honest mind. A former family friend who provided copies of invitation lists showing instances where invitations were extended to Elise only. None of these were dramatic on their own, but together they created a pattern. Patterns are hard to argue with. And, of course, there was the moral calculus. I asked myself constantly, am I doing this for pride, or am I doing it because my son deserves dignity? The answer was resoundingly the latter. Every step I took was measured against that standard. If the plan guzzled into spectacle, or if it risked Noah's well-being, I'd scrap it. But if it revealed truth, if it preserved dignity, if it created a safer life for my boy, then it was worth every sleepless night. As the setup solidified, I noticed subtle shifts in how I moved through the world. I stopped flinching when people praised Elise in public. I didn't seek validation from my parents anymore. I sought it from the quiet satisfaction of a plan well made. I became calmer in family interactions, sometimes deliberately distant, sometimes unnervingly pleasant, because both reactions unnerved them in different ways. They could no longer say I was erratic. I was in control. It unnerved them to see me stable. Elise, for her part, remained blissfully content in her bubble. She continued to post pictures of her new things, and when we saw each other she would make those little barbed compliments like, "Oh, you've really improved your place," with this condescending smile that made my skin crawl. I learned to smile back without giving anything away, letting the small slight slide into my record keeping. It was almost meditative, like gardening, where every pruning made the plant stronger and more purposeful. I pruned my interactions with them in a way that conserved energy and maximized impact. Months of preparation passed in a blur of quiet, calculated moves. There was a tension coiled in me that felt almost musical, tight, ready to snap, but controlled. The plan had parts that depended on timing. A neighborhood association meeting where my parents would be speaking about family and community, a charity gala where public donations and statements were part of the evening, and Elise's birthday, which promised an audience. I could strike at one of them, or I could create a moment that made the truth impossible to deny across all these settings. The longer I waited, the richer the harvest became. Then, one ordinary Tuesday, everything clicked into place in a way I hadn't anticipated. A public figure, the head of the charity my parents loved to support, announced a review of donation transparency in a local paper. The article included an interview that praised families who were models of community giving. My parents were quoted, of course, thanking the organization and highlighting family values. I read the article with my morning coffee and felt a cold thrill. If I could pair that article with the pattern of small inconsistencies I'd documented, donation slips, invitation lists, eyewitness accounts, I could expose the gap between what they told the public and what they did in private. The association meeting was 2 weeks away, Elise's birthday party was next month, and the gala would be in a month. Timing was everything. I called my lawyer and updated him. He spoke softly on the phone, reminding me to preserve evidence and not act impulsively. Make it about facts, he said. Make them undeniable. Leave room for the truth to speak. I felt no hesitation. This wasn't him telling me to be meek. It was him telling me to be unassailable. I started to set the final pieces in motion. I arranged for the aunt to be at the association meeting. I nudged a few neighbors, people who had previously admired my parents publicly but privately carried questions, so that they'd be present. I prepared a small, controlled packet of documents that I could present if it came to that. I made a private list of questions I wanted answered at the meeting. I plotted out the one line I would say if I stood up and told the room the truth. A single, carefully chosen sentence that would cut through the performance without tipping into melodrama. Everything felt aligned, like a map filling in with routes to the same destination. I felt a strange calm, the kind that comes before a storm you know you can weather. Noah was enrolled in an after-school program that evening. I'd arranged it so he wouldn't be present at the association meeting in case things turned ugly. My primary concern remained his safety and well-being. The rest, exposure, consequence, acknowledgement, would follow. And then, 5 days before the meeting, something happened that no amount of planning could have predicted. I got a call from Elise. Her voice was cautious, almost nervous. She said she wanted to talk, that she'd heard about the donation transparency review, and that it had made her uncomfortable. She didn't ask to meet in person. Instead, she asked if I could drop by her apartment for coffee. I felt an instant adrenaline spike. Part of me wanted to refuse, to keep distance, but another part wondered if this was an opportunity. People don't call unless something's shifting. When I arrived, Elise opened the door alone. Her hair was pulled back, and the easy confidence she usually wore was frayed at the edges. She invited me in like we were merely neighbors. I sat on the couch across from her while she fidgeted with a mug. I think Mom and Dad might be in over their heads with some things, she said slowly. And I don't mean money. I mean expectations. They're different than I thought. There's talk at the office about donations, about how things look, and it's making me uncomfortable. My heart hammering, I kept my voice steady. What do you mean? She hesitated. I don't want to say too much, but maybe we need to talk to them. Maybe we need to get ahead of this. I don't want any trouble. Her eyes flicked to mine, searching, weighing. For a second, the old hope rose in me. Maybe Elise was finally going to stand with us. Maybe she recognized the harm and wanted to course correct. But I'd learned to be skeptical. People change when the optics change. I asked a few careful questions, watching her closely. Elise's answers were evasive. She sounded sincere, but sincere in the way people sound when they've been startled by a leak in a comfortable life. She did something that surprised me. She leaned in and said softly, "Henry, if something comes out, I don't want to be destroyed by it. I love Mom and Dad. I don't want them to be embarrassed. Can we handle this privately? Maybe you and I talk to them together?" Her hands folded around her mug as if it were a lifeline. It was tempting, almost a perfect opening. If Elise was genuinely worried, bringing her into the fold could neutralize her and give me an ally from the inside. If she was crafty, bringing her in could let me see her cards. Either way, It was a pivot point. I felt the plan teeter between execution and evolution. I told her I needed time to think, and she nodded, relief flickering across her face. As I walked back to my car, my mind raced with possibilities. If Elise truly wanted to protect our parents, she could be the thing that made the fallout manageable and the reconciliation possible, something I hadn't expected to want. Or she could be positioning herself to control the narrative when the truth came out, to salvage only what served her. Either way, the next 2 weeks would be decisive. I drove home with a strange mix of anticipation and dread. The association meeting was approaching, and with Elise's call, the stakes had just become higher and more unpredictable. The plan, which had been a map with clear routes, now had a wild card. Everything I'd built, the evidence, the allies, the timing, remained solid. But people are variables, and Elise's sudden unease could mean anything. It could be the key to bringing my parents to their senses, or it could be a moment where she tried to reshape the outcome in her favor. That night, I sat at my kitchen table with the binder of receipts and the lawyer's notes spread before me. Noah was at his homework table, humming to himself and drawing planets with reckless joy. I felt a fierce protectiveness and a deep, growing resolve. Whatever happened next, I would not let them define Noah's future or his worth. I had prepared for this slow, methodical moment for months, but I also knew plans must bend when life shifts under your feet. The meeting was in 3 days. Elise had agreed to think about what she'd said, promising to call. My aunt had confirmed she'd attend. A couple of neighbors said they'd be there to hear what everyone had to say. The charity head was scheduled to present an update. My documents were ready, and somewhere, my parents were probably polishing their speeches about family and integrity, oblivious to the net I'd woven. As I prepared to step into the final week before everything could change, a small, absurd part of me remembered the first night I'd sat in my car and felt that raw, exhilarating clarity. Back then it had felt like a vague, dangerous idea. Now it had shape. Now it had teeth. Now it felt inevitable. The night before the association meeting, Elise called again, her voice tight with nerves. She said she'd thought about what we'd talked about and that she wanted to come with me to the meeting, not to stand with my side, necessarily, but to be there while things were said aloud. She asked if I'd let her. I told her I'd prefer she be honest in whatever she said, and to be prepared for consequences she might not like. She hesitated, then agreed. I could hear the tremor in her voice, and, for a sliver of a second, wondered if she was finally feeling the weight of what she'd helped build. Then she said, "See you there," and hung up. On the morning of the meeting, I felt a clarity I hadn't expected. Not triumph, exactly, but a kind of resolute calm that comes from knowing you've done everything necessary and nothing cruel beyond truth. I dressed carefully, not to look flashy or vindictive, but like a man who'd weathered a storm and come through on the other side. Noah was at school. My aunt had promised to be there. A handful of neighbors said they'd attend. My binder of documents was tucked beneath my coat like a shield. Bank statements, donation records, screenshots, invitation lists, and notes from conversations with people who'd watched the pattern unfold for years. My lawyer had given me a final checklist: speak clearly, present facts, do not attack emotionally, make space for corroboration. Let the evidence do the work, he'd said. The meeting room smelled faintly of coffee and polished wood. The association always started with a few routine announcements: charity gala logistics, neighborhood watch updates, little rituals meant to reassure everyone that order and civility ruled. My parents were there, smiling in that practiced way that made my skin prickle, expecting applause for their forthcoming remarks about family values. Elise arrived a few minutes before me and sat towards the back, where she avoided my eyes. Her shoulders were tight. She kept smoothing the skirt she'd chosen like it would iron out whatever discomfort sat in her chest. When it was my turn to speak, I stood slowly, waiting until the room quieted. I could feel dozens of eyes on me, some curious, some polite, some plainly bored. I introduced myself, gave my name, my age, and said that I wished I were there to talk about garden club schedules, but I wasn't. "I'm here because I believe the community deserves the truth," I said softly. I outlined the issue succinctly, public statements about family support and community giving that didn't line up with the facts I documented. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't call anyone cruel. I showed them pieces of paper, donation receipts that bore Elise's name, but listed transactions that didn't match volunteer logs, emails acknowledging gifts that appeared as donations to the public but were routed in ways that benefited Elise directly, polite notes from neighbors who'd once assumed everything was above board and now had questions. The room listened. I watched my parents as I spoke. The practiced calm on my mother's face flickered, like a stage light briefly misaligned. My father's jaw tightened. They exchanged a look that had always meant dismissal, but this time dismissal didn't land. I passed the binder to my aunt, who quietly confirmed she'd kept copies of similar notes she'd found over the years. That small act, an older family member validating what I'd said, shifted the room in subtle but real ways. People leaned forward. Conversations dulled as the evidence accumulated. When I finished, I asked for a formal review of the charity's donations and transparency practices. I said, plainly, that the community deserved to know whether public claims matched private actions. I asked the association to invite the charity's head to present a report, and I offered all my documentation to be included. I made my request not as a scream for retribution, but as a citizen asking for accountability. Then I sat down. What happened next was quieter than I'd imagined, but somehow vaster in its impact. Neighbors approached me with questions, not accusations. People nodded, a few heads lowered in a way that felt like shame. The charity's representative, who was present that day to give an update, looked uncomfortable when I handed them photocopies of the receipts. They said they would conduct an internal audit and that transparency was their priority. The association chair thanked me for bringing the matter forward, with a civility that felt formal but not neutral. Someone asked if Elise wanted to say anything. She stood then, pale and clearly wrestling with what to say. For the first time in years, her voice was not sharp or practiced. It was raw. She admitted she'd known about certain financial slips, that she'd accepted help she hadn't fully understood, that she'd never asked how it all worked because it had been easier to be the favored child than to be curious. She said she'd been terrified of losing her parents' approval and that she'd allowed their narrative to persist without question. She apologized, sincerely, as far as anyone could tell, and then stepped down. My parents did not stand. They watched, stoic and small, as people around them processed the revelations. The chair announced that the association would request a formal financial report from the charity and consider temporarily suspending my parents' roles on community committees while the audit proceeded. That was procedural language, dry and administrative, but to them it was a public removal of the stage they performed on. A neighbor I'd long respected, someone who had admired my parents for years, came up and asked them, in a voice trembling with polite anger, to explain the discrepancies. Under polite pressure, they offered vague defenses about bookkeeping errors and miscommunication, the kind of language people use when their sense of moral clarity is slipping. The following week moved faster than I'd expected. The charity's audit turned up irregularities, donations recorded that didn't match volunteer work, overlapping receipts, money routed through third parties in ways that raised questions. The charity released a statement acknowledging an internal review. My parents, who had always been proud of their standing, found themselves removed from committee leadership pending the outcome. Social invitations slowed. The same people who'd used them as examples of community virtue now nodded at them with a more cautious distance. Public consequences are one thing. Private consequences felt heavier. My parents closed ranks briefly, met with lawyers, and tried for a damage control narrative that painted my actions as a betrayal. Elise, who had stood in that room and admitted complicity, wavered at first under the family pressure. There were furious phone calls from my father demanding explanations, from my mother accusing me of wanting to humiliate them. Their words were sharp and full of a hurt that felt performative, an attempt to reverse public perception by positioning themselves as the wounded party. But the truth has a kind of inertia. Once a community starts to look closely, its curiosity turns into scrutiny. Local papers ran small pieces on the audit. The charity's board promised reforms and transparency. My parents' names, once associated with the garden show and the luncheon circuit, were now followed by phrases like under review and temporarily removed. It wasn't criminal. There was no dramatic law enforcement raid, no rattling of handcuffs. For them, the undoing was different. a steady erosion of the admiration they'd banked on for decades. Invitations dwindled. The polished smile they'd used to command rooms didn't hold the same sway. As for Elise, the fall was complicated. She reached out to me after the initial wave of public scrutiny, voice small and shaken. She wanted to talk, not to defend, but to understand. In a conversation that had the awkwardness of two people standing on opposite sides of a glass wall, she told me she'd been terrified of losing everything she'd been taught constituted security. She confessed to being dishonest, to ignoring questions, to letting her privileges slide by without thought. I listened. I did not forgive in that moment. Grudges don't dissolve with a single confession, but I recognized that she was, in her own way, dismantled. Her life had been propped up by my parents' choices. When those supports shifted, she toppled with them. The personal fallout for me was not solely public vindication. People offered support, neighbors who brought casseroles, friends who gave leads for additional therapy programs for Noah. A small foundation that helped families like ours contacted me after reading a local article and offered a grant to cover a portion of Noah's treatments. Those practical responses mattered more than drama ever could. Watching my son get the care he needed from professionals who treated him with dignity and warmth felt like the real victory. It was quiet, it was steady, and it was exactly what I'd wanted when I'd started down this path. There were hard decisions too. My parents reached out, at one point through a lawyer, offering a formal apology and a small, conditional financial settlement meant to avoid continued public attention. The offer came across as legal speak wrapped in a feigned contrition, and I refused. My lawyer advised me to consider whether accepting would help Noah or simply let them buy back their dignity at our expense. I chose to protect Noah's interests without letting my family purchase their absolution. In the end, I told them no, that genuine accountability and change mattered more than money taken as a bandage. The weeks turned into months. The charity implemented reforms. My parents resigned from a couple of nominal positions because the social pressure had made their presence untenable. Invitations to soirees and committees ceased. People who had once sought their company now sent polite notes, distant, civil, and careful. The inheritance my parents had poured into Elise remained legally hers, and the courts found no impropriety severe enough to reallocate assets. Legally, the money stayed where it was. Socially, though, everything shifted. Elise had to face a life where the perks were not guaranteed and where talent and work, not family glow, had to win respect. She learned, painfully, to stand on her own. For me, the fallout was less theatrical and more restorative. I watched my son thrive under better medical care. I expanded my business slowly, accepting a consultancy that required travel but paid well enough to build a more solid cushion. My aunt became a regular presence in our lives, bringing Noah homemade pies and quietly offering stability the way only an older, kinder relative can. Relationships I'd dismissed as frayed came back, for the most part, on healthier terms. Neighbors who apologized in small ways, acquaintances who offered support, and friends who reminded me that family could be chosen as much as born. I won't pretend there wasn't a part of me that felt a quiet, private satisfaction when I saw my parents at a small community event months later, their smiles brittle, their conversation guarded. They greeted a few people, but the glance I caught between them was not one of victory. It was small and haunted, the look of people who'd rested their identity on a house of cards and watched the wind pry the corners loose. I didn't gloat. I recognized the complexity of human failure. Cruelty has consequences, and sometimes consequences teach in ways apology does not. Elise called me one afternoon, months after everything had started to settle. She asked if Noah could come over for a short visit. No pressure, nothing elaborate. I thought of her confession at the meeting, her faltering attempts at contrition, and the way she'd offered to be present. I said yes, but with boundaries. She arrived with a small box of cookies and a note that read simply, "I'm sorry." She sat with Noah on the floor, clumsy and careful, and for a moment, I saw a girl trying to be more than the favored child, trying to build an honest life. It wasn't forgiveness yet, for either of us. It was a beginning. In the end, the revenge I'd set in motion was neither petty nor wild. It was precise, evidence presented in a place where reputation mattered, exposed with calm facts. corroborated by people who had the courage to look honestly at what they'd once admired. The fallout was not a spectacle of ruin, but a slow, inexorable reconfiguration of social standing and personal responsibility. My parents lost the pedestal. Elise lost the safety net. I gained what I'd always wanted, not to see them humiliated, but to see accountability, to secure my son's dignity, and to build a life we didn't have to defend with explanations. There were moments I had to wrestle with. Did I want punishment or repair? Could there be repair after what they'd done? Time will tell. For now, Noah sleeps in a room that smells like books and crayons, his treatments managed, his laughter audible in the kitchen as he practices piano. I have a business that grows slowly and honestly, a community that supports us more than it judged us, and a sense of peace that was once a foreign thing. I don't visit my parents often. When I do, it is on my terms, and sometimes we speak, sometimes we don't. The thing I wanted most, my son's safety and dignity, was not something anyone could take away again. On the night everything started to shift, sitting in my car with a plan in my head, I had felt a cold thrill at the idea of reclaiming control. On the night the meeting ended and my binder left in the hands of people who could act, I felt only a quiet resolve. Vindication without malice, truth without vengeance. The final reckoning wasn't a shout. It was the steady, unflinching presentation of fact in a room that could no longer ignore it. Years from now, when people in the neighborhood walk past the community center or attend the garden show, they might not remember the finer points of what happened. They might remember only that reputations can be built and undone, that kindness and truth matter, and that families are complicated, fallible things. I would like to think they'll also remember that a father fought for his son and that, in the end, what mattered was the life we built afterward, one measured by care, honesty, and the refusal to let someone else's cruelty define us. The last image I have of them is simple. My parents standing in the doorway of a community event, watching as people milled by with polite distance, then turning to each other with a look that said, quietly and finally, we cannot go back to how things were. And as I walked away that day, Noah on my hand and the future ahead of us, I felt something I had been chasing since the first cold dismissal, not the joy of revenge, but the calm, steady satisfaction of having protected what mattered most. My name's Trevor, I'm 28, and I've never been the kind of guy to flaunt my success. I work in finance. I recently got promoted to a position that comes with a six-figure salary, and honestly, I've been quietly proud of myself, but my family? Not so much. My parents have always favored my younger brother, Kyle, who's 25, loud, and somehow effortlessly charming despite never holding a real job longer than 6 months. Growing up, it was always Kyle this and Kyle that, while I quietly followed the rules, worked hard, and tried not to get noticed. I learned a long time ago that my achievements didn't really matter in our household, and I'd accepted that. It all came to a head at my birthday dinner last week. I had planned a small, casual celebration at my apartment. Just me, Mom, Dad, and Kyle, nothing fancy. I didn't want anything extravagant. Honestly, I just wanted to enjoy a night without the usual commentary about how I was too serious or never having fun. I had worked my ass off all year, and I just wanted to eat my mom's casserole and maybe have a beer without someone subtly undermining me. I didn't tell anyone about the promotion yet, because, well, it's my news to share. I thought it would be nice to tell them when the moment felt right. Of course, Kyle had other plans. He somehow already knew about it. I didn't even mention it once during the evening, but he brought it up like he was announcing a team victory at a game, grinning from ear to ear. So, big congrats to Trevor, he said, smirking, finally moving up at that finance place. Heard it's a nice paycheck. I froze. My mom laughed, because that was her thing, laughing at Kyle's jokes, even when they were obviously smug digs at me. Dad just nodded, barely glancing up from his plate. I forced a smile, pretending I wasn't internally grinding my teeth. We ate. We talked about nothing important, and I tried to keep the evening calm. But then, at some point, I noticed my wallet was missing. I had set it down on the counter next to my drink when I went to grab dessert, and now it was gone. I asked Kyle, casually at first, thinking maybe he had moved it. His grin widened. Oh, that? I just borrowed it for a quick favor, he said, as if it were the most natural thing in the world. My stomach dropped. I laughed nervously, trying to play it off. Borrowed it. Kyle, that's my wallet. Mom piped in, smiling like she always did when the two of them teamed up to ignore me. It's just family, Trevor. He'll give it back. I swallowed. The phrase felt like a slap. Just family, they said. Just family. Like it excused taking $500 out of my wallet, or the hundreds more he had drained from me in college loans he never repaid. I said nothing, because that's what I'd been trained to do, bite my tongue, smile, and let the chaos roll over me. 8 hours later, I checked my accounts to transfer a bill I had to cover first thing in the morning. That's when I realized Kyle hadn't just borrowed a few hundred. He had taken $25,000. $25,000 from my savings account that I had painstakingly built over the last 4 years. My hands shook, my chest tightened, and the room felt like it was closing in. I texted Kyle, calm at first. Kyle, we need to talk. Now. No response. I called. Nothing. I tried Mom, hoping she'd intervene, and she just laughed when she answered. He's a good boy, Trevor. Don't be so uptight. It's just family. By this point, I realized nothing would be solved by yelling or begging. I spent the next few hours pacing, thinking about every time I had swallowed my frustration with them, every slight, every unfair comparison, every time Kyle had gotten away with things I never would have. My mind was buzzing with anger and disbelief. I wanted to confront them, but I knew it would just feed the cycle of their amusement at my expense. Something had to change. Something big. By 6:48 a.m., after sleepless hours of planning, I knew exactly what I was going to do. I wasn't going to let this go. This wasn't just about the money. It was about respect, boundaries, and finally making them realize that their little games had consequences. And when it started, it wasn't going to be subtle. I didn't sleep that night. I couldn't. Not after seeing what Kyle had done. It wasn't just the money. It was the audacity, the casual way he assumed he could take from me and Mom's smug dismissal as though it were normal. I kept replaying every moment of that dinner, every laugh, every glance where they all made me feel small without actually saying a word. I had spent years trying to be the responsible one, and now I was furious at myself for ever thinking that would earn me respect. I decided to let them think I was still calm for the moment. I got up early, brewed coffee, and tried to act normal, all while my mind was running through options. I didn't want to give Kyle the satisfaction of seeing me panic. I didn't want Mom to get another laugh out of it. I wanted them to feel exactly what it was like to be powerless in a situation where they had thought they were untouchable. By mid-morning, I had checked my accounts again. The withdrawal was still there. Kyle had spent it, gone. I didn't know on what yet, but it didn't matter. What mattered was that I had to think strategically. I texted him again, deliberately casual. Hey, can you return the money by the end of the week? Thanks. No response. Of course, no response. Kyle had always been able to treat me like I was invisible when it suited him. And Mom, as always, just laughed at my frustration. Later that day, Dad came by my apartment. I could hear him in the hall before he knocked, his heavy steps echoing. He pushed the door open with that subtle air of entitlement that always made me feel like I had to apologize for existing. Trevor, he said, smiling faintly, heard about the promotion. Good for you. It was said with such a casual tone, like he was reporting weather, not acknowledging the fact that I had worked my way up while Kyle had coasted through life. I nodded, smiling politely. I didn't say anything about the missing money. Family dinner tomorrow night, he added. Kyle wants to celebrate a bit, you know? I almost laughed, a bitter laugh, because it wasn't about me celebrating. It was about Kyle taking credit for my achievements and the implicit expectation that I'd just sit there and smile. I said nothing, because saying anything would have just fueled the same pattern. I wanted to take control, not feed their narrative. The next 24 hours were a mix of quiet rage and observation. I started to notice little things that I'd always ignored. Kyle leaving his dirty dishes in the sink and Mom complimenting him for being helpful when he finally rinsed them. Dad praising Kyle for being charming with family friends while making a passing comment about me being too serious. It was relentless. I realized that this wasn't just about my wallet. It was about a lifetime of being overlooked, dismissed, and treated like I existed only when convenient for their ego. Then came the final straw. My phone buzzed while I was at work, a message from Kyle. I opened it cautiously, half expecting an apology, half expecting more arrogance. It was worse than anything I could have imagined. Hey, thanks again for the money. Mom said you'd understand. It's just family. Don't worry about it. That was it. No remorse, no acknowledgement of wrongdoing. Just casual entitlement, the kind that had defined my entire relationship with them. My chest tightened. My hands shook so badly I had to set the phone down. I spent the rest of the day going through every memory where I'd been overlooked, every slight that had been excused, every time they had laughed at me for being responsible while Kyle got away with negligence. By the time I got home, I knew I wasn't going to sit silently anymore. Something had to happen, and it had to happen in a way that made them see what they had done. I needed them to realize that their assumptions of untouchability, of always having the upper hand, were over. That evening, the breaking point fully revealed itself. We had a small family get-together, nothing special, just the usual routine. Kyle walked in first, smirking like he owned the place, Mom trailing behind him with her characteristic smugness, and Dad pretending neutrality. I greeted them politely, but I could feel the tension under my skin. Every smile I forced was a mask over the boiling frustration inside. The night started normally enough. Kyle talked about himself, as usual, regaling everyone with exaggerated stories of his supposed achievements, while I quietly observed. I noticed Dad subtly siding with him on almost everything, steering conversations toward Kyle's supposed brilliance, while my contributions were met with mild acknowledgement at best. Mom kept laughing at Kyle's jokes, even the ones that were clearly meant to belittle me. Then it happened. Kyle leaned over to my plate, grinning. Hey, Trevor, can you pass me the checkbook? I need to pay off some stuff for dinner. I froze. My checkbook? He hadn't mentioned anything about borrowing money from me yet, and suddenly he assumed he could just take it, like always. No, I said firmly. Silence fell. Mom laughed nervously, like she always did when the tension in the room made her uncomfortable. Oh, come on, Trevor, don't be so uptight, she said. I'm not, I said, trying to keep my voice even. But you can't just take my money. That's not how this works. Kyle laughed, leaning back in his chair, smirking. Relax, it's just family, he said. His words were a dagger. Just family. Just family. As if that excused every slight, every theft, every humiliation. That was the moment everything inside me snapped. I realized then that no words, no appeals, no quiet suffering would ever change them. They weren't just unaware of the impact of their actions, they thrived on it. I could see it in their smug smiles, their dismissive gestures, the casual cruelty that had defined my entire life with them. The breaking point wasn't just anger. It was clarity. I understood that this was my chance to change the dynamic completely. If I acted now, I could finally claim the respect I deserved, or at least make them feel what it was like to have someone you underestimate quietly plotting against you. By the end of that night, I had a plan forming in my mind. Not a chaotic one, not something reckless. I wasn't going to yell, I wasn't going to beg, I wasn't going to plead. I was going to act, strategically, in a way that they would never expect. And when it started, it wasn't going to be small. I stayed silent as Kyle and Mom continued their gloating, the casual entitlement dripping from every word, unaware that I was already several moves ahead in my mental chess game. I could almost hear their arrogance echoing off the walls, the same arrogance that had driven me to this edge. I wanted them to think they were untouchable one last time, because the moment I struck, it would be complete. And that's when I decided that tomorrow morning, at exactly 6:48 a.m., everything would change. The morning after that last dinner, I woke up feeling like my chest had been hollowed out. I had barely slept, and my mind was a whirl of anger, frustration, and something heavier. The realization that my family's disregard for me ran deeper than I had imagined. Kyle hadn't just taken my money. He had taken my trust, my peace of mind, and, somehow, the small sense of safety I had built around my achievements. It was suffocating. I poured myself a cup of coffee, sat by the window, and stared out at the city, trying to gather my thoughts. My wallet, my savings, my trust, it all felt gone. I spent the morning in a fog, replaying the previous night over and over, thinking about every time Kyle had assumed he was entitled to more than me. I remembered the college tuition he had borrowed from me, the borrowed car that I had fixed for him, the countless times Mom and Dad had excused his behavior. It all crystallized in my mind. My family didn't just favor him. They thrived on undermining me, quietly celebrating my compliance. And for the first time, I realized how much it had shaped me. The thought of confronting them, of trying to reason with them, only made me angrier. I couldn't reason with someone who had spent years treating me as a secondary character in their own story. That anger simmered as I realized that if I wanted respect, if I wanted to reclaim what was mine, I had to do it myself. Quietly, strategically, and I had to make it sting. For the next few days, I withdrew. I avoided calls from Mom, ignored messages from Kyle, and spent long hours alone, focusing on my work, my finances, and my own mental clarity. At first, it felt like rock bottom. I had lost $25,000, been disrespected in front of everyone I cared about, and realized that my parents wouldn't step in. But in that isolation, a strange clarity emerged. I realized that everything I needed to rebuild wasn't outside of me. It was within. I started with small victories. I meticulously reviewed my accounts, noticing patterns and loopholes I had previously overlooked. I invested in smarter financial tools, tightened my security, and began quietly growing my savings again. This time with an unshakable resolve to never let anyone have that level of access to my life again. Each small deposit, each calculated investment, felt like reclaiming a piece of myself. Then came the work side. I started taking on projects that others in my office ignored, showing my capabilities without drawing attention. It wasn't about recognition yet. It was about building a foundation that couldn't be ignored, a quiet but undeniable proof of my competence. Every late night I spent working, every strategy one refined, every project I completed successfully, built my confidence and self-worth in ways my family never had. It was a slow process, almost painfully so, but it felt solid. Unlike Kyle's charades, my progress was real and sustainable. As the days passed, I began noticing a shift in myself. I no longer felt like a secondary character in my own life. I wasn't just reclaiming money, I was reclaiming dignity. I started exercising again, focusing on my health, which had taken a back seat during the long years of trying to appease my family. My mind was clearer, my resolve stronger, and the anger that had once threatened to consume me had transformed into something more powerful: purpose. But the family dynamics weren't going to change on their own. Kyle continued as if nothing had happened. At work, I remained professional, keeping my strategies and investments private, planning my next moves quietly. And at home, my family's arrogance only grew. They assumed I had swallowed the insult, that the money was gone and the lesson over. I let them think that, because appearances mattered to them far more than reality. Every phone call I ignored, every dismissive laugh from Mom, every smug comment from Kyle was a reminder that I was no longer at their mercy. I was biding my time. They had underestimated the quiet patience and strategic thinking that had always defined me. They assumed my compliance was weakness. They couldn't have been more wrong. And then there were the moments when I almost faltered. Sitting alone in my apartment, counting my savings, I sometimes felt the weight of loneliness pressing down. I thought about my friends, who didn't understand the intricacies of family dynamics at that level, and I felt a fleeting pang of doubt. But each time, I reminded myself, this was temporary. Every step I took, every calculated move, was leading to a point where the scales would finally tip in my favor. I started documenting everything: financial records, every text from Kyle, every dismissive remark from Mom, every subtle manipulation by Dad. I wasn't sure yet what I'd do with all of it, but I knew it would be useful someday. It was my insurance, my proof, my quiet preparation for the moment when their sense of untouchability would meet its match. I wasn't acting impulsively. I was building a fortress of evidence, one brick at a time, and with each brick, my confidence grew. Then came a breakthrough. While reviewing my finances one night, I discovered an overlooked investment account that had quietly grown over the years. It wasn't enough to replace the $25,000 Kyle had taken, but it was a start. More importantly, it reminded me of my capabilities, of my ability to rebuild quietly and steadily. That evening, I set aside time to calculate every possible scenario: how to grow my funds, how to secure them from my family, how to make sure Kyle and Mom couldn't touch them again. I felt a thrill that I hadn't experienced in years, the kind of thrill that comes from realizing you are no longer helpless. Over the next few weeks, my routine became disciplined. I worked, I invested, I planned, I exercised, and I quietly observed. My family still acted as if nothing had happened, still flaunting their entitlement and dismissiveness. Every comment from Kyle, every laugh from Mom, every passive-aggressive remark from Dad became fuel for my strategy. I learned patience, something I hadn't truly practiced before, because I knew that the moment I struck had to be perfect. It couldn't be rushed. And as I slowly rebuilt my financial security and my self-worth, I began to notice subtle changes in myself beyond money and career. I no longer felt the need to seek their approval. Their opinions of me no longer dictated my mood or my decisions. I was reclaiming something far more valuable than cash. I was reclaiming control over my life, control over my dignity, control over the narrative that had been defined by them for decades. One night, as I sat reviewing another round of investments, I realized that I had reached a point I hadn't thought possible. I had rebuilt not only my finances, but my confidence. I felt a quiet, powerful satisfaction knowing that when the time came, I would be ready. Kyle's audacity and Mom's dismissiveness had given me everything I needed to plan meticulously, to act decisively, and to finally claim the respect I had been denied for so long. I wasn't just preparing revenge. I was preparing a statement, a turning point that would make them understand the consequences of underestimating me. And I knew exactly how I was going to start. Every morning, I would review my accounts, check for inconsistencies, and make adjustments. Every evening, I would jot down notes, refine strategies, and think about how I could leverage everything I had learned over the years. My focus wasn't on petty anger anymore. It was precision. Every action would be calculated, every reaction anticipated. I had studied their behaviors for decades without even realizing it, and now all that knowledge was going to be my advantage. The first step was information. I needed to know where they were weak, what they valued, and how I could manipulate the situation without tipping them off. Kyle, for example, thrived on attention. Any slight to his ego made him defensive, even when it was minor. Mom lived in appearances and affirmation. She cared more about how things looked to the outside world than reality. Dad was subtly controlling, always positioning himself as the neutral arbiter while quietly undermining my achievements. Understanding this was crucial. If I acted without taking it into account, I would look foolish, or worse, weak. I began quietly observing them under the guise of casual interactions. Family dinners were back on the table, literally, and I attended them as if nothing had changed. I laughed at Kyle's jokes, made neutral conversation with Mom, nodded politely at Dad's commentary. All the while, I was watching and noting. Where they overstepped, where they flaunted entitlement, where they revealed their arrogance most clearly. Every word, every gesture, every casual smirk became data. At the same time, I started subtly reinforcing my own network. I reached out to a few colleagues who respected me professionally but didn't know about my family dynamics. I shared minor victories, quietly impressing them with my strategic thinking, and in return, I gained allies who could potentially provide leverage or witness credibility if needed. I didn't mention my family directly. I didn't need to. But I started planting seeds, positioning myself as someone who was capable, resourceful, and respected outside the small, toxic ecosystem I had grown up in. Financially, I fortified my position. I transferred my remaining assets into separate accounts, diversified my investments, and set up contingency plans. I knew Kyle wouldn't stop at one theft if he sensed opportunity, and Mom and Dad would continue to excuse his behavior if it benefited them socially or financially. My money, and by extension, my security, needed to be untouchable. It was the first line of defense, and I treated it like a fortress. Then came the psychological setup. I started planting small but deliberate hints that I was more than they realized. At family dinners, I would casually mention work projects, speaking just enough to pique curiosity without bragging. I would share stories of colleagues who had achieved recognition for their strategic decisions, letting them assume I was in the loop and capable of influence far beyond what they thought. Kyle would tilt his head, Mom would smile nervously, and Dad would offer a faint nod. But none of them realized I was constructing a mental web around them, one where every piece of information was carefully placed to manipulate perception. I also began collecting tangible evidence. Emails, texts, financial records, past loans, and other small instances of entitlement were cataloged meticulously. Every interaction Kyle had ever had where he had taken advantage of me, or where my parents had silently approved, was documented. I stored them securely, organized by date and event, because I knew that when the moment came, I needed an irrefutable record. I didn't want this to be a he said she said situation. I wanted it airtight. One night, while reviewing the documents, I realized something important. They had underestimated not just my capacity for strategic thinking, but my patience. Kyle assumed I would panic or plead. Mom assumed I would smile and forgive. Dad assumed I would let things slide. They all assumed that I was predictable. That assumption was going to be my greatest weapon. I smiled quietly to myself, imagining their reactions when the carefully constructed plan came to fruition. I also considered timing. This wasn't something to rush. The setup had to be perfect, the stakes high enough to command attention, but not so high that I looked irrational. I watched their schedules, their routines, and the subtle ways they interacted with one another. I noted when Kyle was most confident, when Mom was most distracted, when Dad's authority wavered. The perfect moment would need all these factors aligned. A small window where their arrogance would be most vulnerable to disruption. At work, I began subtly testing scenarios. I practiced how I would confront them, how I would deliver the consequences of their actions without losing my composure. I rehearsed mental simulations of conversations, considering every possible reaction and planning countermoves. It was like chess, and for the first time in years, I felt completely in control of the board. But it wasn't just strategy. I also prepared emotionally. I knew the confrontation would stir old wounds, and I needed to remain calm. Any hint of uncontrolled anger would feed their narrative, prove their assumptions right, and ruin the impact of my plan. I practiced detachment, mentally rehearsing the feeling of delivering the outcome with quiet, undeniable authority. I wasn't going to yell or beg. I wasn't going to plead. I was going to act with precision, and the results would speak louder than any words. I even started small tests of leverage. Minor, innocuous situations where I could demonstrate my capability without alerting them. A financial suggestion at dinner, a subtle correction when Kyle boasted incorrectly, a fact check that Mom would notice but couldn't challenge. Each small action was a psychological test, gauging their reactions and reinforcing my understanding of their weaknesses. It was painstakingly slow, almost invisible, but the groundwork was solidifying. And through all of this, the anger I had once felt, the fury that had initially spurred me into action, had transformed. It wasn't blind rage anymore. It was clarity, a cold understanding that the only way to assert my worth was through calculated action. I wasn't reacting impulsively. I was preparing deliberately. The stakes had grown beyond the wallet, beyond the stolen money. This was about respect, dignity, and finally establishing a position where my achievements and boundaries could not be ignored. By the end of that week, the setup was nearly complete. My finances were secure, my documentation was organized, my mental rehearsals were sharp, and I had begun subtly influencing perceptions without anyone realizing. I could almost see the moment in my mind, the exact way they would overestimate their control, the precise moment when their arrogance would backfire, and the perfect opportunity to strike. The irony was satisfying. For decades, they had underestimated me, laughed at me, and dismissed me. Now, I was quietly building a scenario where their underestimation would be their downfall. Kyle, Mom, and Dad thought they were untouchable, that their assumptions about me were correct. They had no idea I had spent weeks transforming weakness into strength, chaos into strategy, and betrayal into opportunity. And as I went to bed that night, I felt the calm that only comes from knowing you have a plan and that every piece of the puzzle was falling into place. Tomorrow, I would begin the final phase, the execution. The morning started early, as planned. I woke at 6:48 a.m., exactly on the dot, feeling a sense of anticipation I hadn't experienced since I first realized how deeply my family had underestimated me. Everything I had done over the past weeks, every investment adjustment, every meticulously documented interaction, every mental rehearsal, was about to converge into one precise, irreversible moment. I brewed coffee and went over my checklist one last time, ensuring that every variable had been accounted for, every potential countermove anticipated. I started with Kyle. I had access to information he didn't even know existed, leverage he had assumed I lacked. I opened my laptop and sent a single, simple message, a bank transfer authorization I had pre-signed and scheduled, but with a catch. The funds he had taken from my account, the $25,000, were locked in a way that could only be released if he returned them through a specific channel. Any attempt to circumvent the process would trigger alerts to me, the bank, and a trusted network of legal advisors I had quietly arranged. In other words, the moment he tried to spend another dime without permission, I would have a paper trail that no one could ignore. I didn't stop there. I had documented every one of Kyle's prior financial exploits. Unpaid loans from me during college, minor scams disguised as favors, and even subtle manipulations that had allowed him to profit at my expense while mom and dad turned a blind eye. I sent these records anonymously to a reputable financial authority, ensuring that any attempt by him to dispute or reclaim those funds would now be subject to scrutiny. The irony wasn't lost on me. The same system he had thought was irrelevant, the same rules he had assumed didn't apply, were now fully in motion, and I was the one controlling them. Next came Mom. I had prepared a package of evidence demonstrating her complicity, her casual dismissal of my concerns, her repeated endorsement of Kyle's entitled behavior, and her financial negligence when it came to my hard-earned money. I sent the documentation to her social circle, to close friends who had often witnessed her favoritism firsthand. The documents were presented neutrally, without accusation, simply laying out facts. The goal wasn't to humiliate unnecessarily, but to make her realize, calmly and irrevocably, that the world outside her little bubble had a record of her behavior. Dad, the passive orchestrator, was last. He had prided himself on being neutral, on controlling appearances while quietly influencing outcomes. I had collected subtle, undeniable evidence of his role in Kyle's behavior, the times he had covered for him, excused his missteps, or dismissed my achievements while elevating Kyle's. I sent a copy to a financial mediator and also to a family attorney I had consulted months earlier, someone independent who could validate the records. The point wasn't to destroy him legally. It was to show that neutrality doesn't absolve responsibility, and that every action, even a subtle one, had consequences. After setting everything in motion, I waited. And then I acted on the final, most dramatic step. I called my parents and Kyle individually, one by one, keeping my voice calm, deliberate, and collected. "Good morning," I said to each. "I thought you'd like to know. I've taken care of some arrangements regarding recent events. You might notice some surprises today." The responses were priceless. Kyle's first was a nervous laugh, quickly cut off by a flash of panic. "Wait, what do you mean?" he stammered, his confidence evaporating. Mom was flustered, trying to laugh it off, but failing, glancing at Dad for support. Dad, always composed, froze for a moment, realizing that his carefully maintained neutrality had no effect in this scenario. For the first time, all three of them faced the tangible consequences of their arrogance, entitlement, and dismissiveness, and they had no way to manipulate the outcome. By mid-morning, chaos began to unfold. Kyle's phone started buzzing incessantly. He had 50 missed calls from banks, financial authorities, and legal advisors, all triggered by actions I had set in motion. Mom's phone followed shortly after, a series of notifications from friends and acquaintances who had received the evidence package, each alerting her to the implications of her favoritism. Dad, of course, got his share, emails and legal notices confirming his indirect role in Kyle's schemes. None of them knew the extent yet, but they were beginning to feel the weight of accountability for the first time. I stayed calm through it all. I didn't gloat. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't plead. I merely observed, taking in the sight of three people who had spent years underestimating me, now confronted with irrefutable proof that I had not only recognized every slight, but had turned it into a meticulously executed strategy of consequence. The air was thick with tension, their previous sense of invincibility shattered silently, without theatrics. Kyle tried to argue, to charm, to claim ignorance. "Trevor, you can't be serious," he said, panic lacing his voice. I didn't think." "You didn't think?" I interrupted calmly. "That's exactly it. You never think. You assume people will forgive, forget, or overlook. I've spent years observing you. I know how you operate. And now, the results are unavoidable. Mom tried to interject, waving her hands in that familiar, dismissive gesture. Trevor, it's just family. It's never just family when boundaries are ignored and trust is stolen, I said. It's only family until someone realizes they can be held accountable. Today, you're learning that accountability has consequences. Dad, always the quiet manipulator, attempted a reasoned tone. Trevor, surely we can settle this. I shook my head slowly, maintaining my composure. No negotiation, no discussion. You were all given every opportunity to act differently. You failed. The actions you've taken and the actions you've excused are now documented and irrevocable. There is no hiding, no rationalizing, no dismissing this as casual oversight. You underestimated me. That mistake ends now. By noon, the effects were undeniable. Kyle's access to funds had been frozen, his recent accounts flagged for review. Mom was fielding messages from friends and colleagues, questioning her favoritism and demanding explanations. Dad's subtle complicity had been exposed to legal verification and financial authorities, forcing him to confront his role in Kyle's actions and my exclusion. All three were scrambling, attempting to regain control, but the structure I had built was airtight. Every move they tried to make triggered another response, each calculated and anticipated, leaving them powerless and exposed. As I watched them unravel, I felt a quiet satisfaction, different from the fleeting triumphs I had imagined as a kid. This was not chaos for chaos's sake. This was justice, executed with precision, calm, and foresight. The same patience I had cultivated, the same strategic thinking, the same careful rebuilding of my own security. All of it culminated in a moment where their arrogance, entitlement, and dismissiveness were fully confronted. And then, finally, I took one last action. A single, carefully composed group message sent to their phones. Every action has consequences. Learn this lesson carefully. Respect is earned, and trust is never to be taken lightly. Trevor. The phones buzzed simultaneously. 47 notifications each. I watched as Kyle's face turned pale, Mom's hands trembled as she scrolled through messages, and Dad finally sat back, silent, realizing that the facade he had relied on for decades was gone. No more excuses, no more laughter, no more casual dismissal. For the first time, all three of them were fully aware of the cost of underestimating me. I didn't celebrate. I didn't gloat. I simply smiled quietly to myself, knowing that years of patience, careful planning, and unwavering self-discipline had paid off. I had turned betrayal into opportunity, disrespect into strategy, and entitlement into a tangible lesson they would never forget. As I closed my laptop and looked out at the city, I felt an overwhelming sense of relief and empowerment. For the first time in my life, I wasn't just surviving the chaos of my family. I was in control. And in that quiet, unassuming moment, I realized something profound. The greatest revenge is not anger or humiliation. It's calm, measured action that leaves the arrogant powerless and the justifiable victorious. I poured another cup of coffee, leaned back in my chair, and let the calm satisfaction settle over me. Years of being overlooked, dismissed, and taken for granted had led to this single, undeniable truth. I had reclaimed my life, my dignity, and my boundaries. And they would never underestimate me again. The silence in my apartment was perfect, unbroken, powerful, a mirror of the control I now held. I sipped my coffee slowly, thinking only one thing. The game had changed, and this time, I was the one holding all the pieces.